So good morning, everybody. We're just going to wait a minute for people to be let in on the Zoom. Nick, you can tell me when we have a critical mass on the Zoom. It always takes a minute or two. Okay, so good morning, everybody. We're just going to wait a minute to let everybody in. It takes a minute or so to come in on Zoom when we start letting everybody in. Hi, good morning. Take a seat. You'll let me know when we have critical mass, Nick? If you want to sit, you can sit over there. You just don't want the screen blocked. Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Liz Hume. I'm the Executive Director for the Alliance for Peace Building, and I am very excited for this event today. I want to talk a little bit about how we came up with it. Johanna Mendelson Forman, who is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center, creator of conflict cuisine, adjunct professor at American University, and just a fixture in Washington, D.C. in terms of the work that you've done. No, you're not old. You are distinguished and have an incredible career here in Washington. I won't go into it. We'll be here all day. You gave me a call 6 months ago and said, we have a problem. We need to have this conversation on how we integrate conflict and peace building into the food security issue that was increasing, was already existing prior to the Ukraine crisis, but obviously greatly exacerbated by that war. So I want to thank you, Johanna, for calling and putting this all together. I'll be handing it over to you to moderate. But before that, I just want to introduce some of our other incredible guests. First, I want to mention Richard Ponzio, my old dear friend, an old friend, also from the Stimson Center, a great partner to AFP, and we do so many events together. And I just want to thank Richard for all his incredible work on this. David Alpher, also an old friend, the conflict violence prevention integrator at USAID, my former office, the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, that is now it'll always be CMM to me, the conflict. Thank you. Former CMM. David has a long history working in conflict affected countries, NGOs, Safer World, working with the US government. So both in and out of the US government, and really focusing in on how do we integrate conflict and peace building. Jonathan Papoulidis, another old friend from a great friend to AFP and brilliant on resilience, conflict integration, is now the global director for fragility and resilience, food for the hungry. So a perfect speaker, but so much experience and world vision. So I can't say enough about Jonathan, and we're so happy to have him here today. Silke Boger, the Counselor for Agriculture at the Delegation of the EU. Another brilliant person to have here to talk about these issues, not only on food, but also the integration of conflict and prevention. And we're so excited that you're here today as well. Why is this conversation so important? When Johanna called me, it was important. Today, it's even more important. The food crisis has only increased. And in May 2022, the US put out a food supplemental, $5 billion in global food aid. How much did they talk about conflict and peace building and prevention in that supplemental? The answer is not much. So we're going to have a big conversation about that today. What do we do about it? How do we integrate it? But this is an ongoing theme we're having with conflict and peace building. COVID, we fought really hard to get conflict and peace building into that strategy, both under the Trump and the Biden administration. It got in there as a second order, but how much funding went to it? Zero. We fought really, really hard for climate change and conflict prevention, showing that those issues are compounding. We had to fight so hard. And I use the word fight. We had to advocate so hard to get that language in there. We did get it in there. Now we have to see what happens, making sure it's implemented. Just like the Global Fragility Act. One of the key parts of that is integration, conflict prevention and peace building integration. But why do we have to keep advocating and fighting every single time to look at what the root causes are and how do we build resilience? So that's a lot of what this discussion is today. Hopefully, we're going to really touch on a lot of the solutions as well and what we should be advocating for. We have incredible speakers, and I'm just thrilled and so grateful for everybody's time today. And Johanna, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Liz, for that very kind introduction, and welcome everybody to this event, which is a hybrid event. I'm glad I nudged you a couple of months ago because in my view, conflict and food are totally integrated issues. And what's ironic to me as just a personal view is that in 2015, our National Intelligence Council made a declaration that food was a national security issue. Now we're talking almost 7 years ago when that document came out. And yet that principle, which was part of a finding, which was done non-politically, has continued to hang out there without integrating it into some of the most important work that is going on around conflict and fragility. And yesterday I was watching a very good pre-UNGA event which was headed by Comfort Iro, the crisis group, an old friend of mine. And, you know, there are 208 million people in acute stages of food insecurity today. And it goes back to the point that I think has come out again and again, and that is we must recognize that hunger is a security problem and access to food is a human right. So what does this get to? And then I'll be happy, you've had wonderful introductions of our panelists already, but I want to say that it's not only the trifecta of climate, COVID, and conflict that David Beasley so well articulated last year as the challenges we face going into that UN Food Security Summit, but there's another trifecta of needs in the framework. I mean, food is not like climate. We can't prevent the raising of temperatures by 1.5 degrees and say that we'll have food security. Food is a complex system, and I know my colleague Silke can go into it as an agricultural expert. But there are three things that we need to end food insecurity. And those three things are, one, to recognize that food is a human right and that it is a basic right. Second, that it is a core component, and I underscore this, a core component of stability and peace, and that the National Security Council said and other governments have said it. And thirdly, that we must reform the global system and understand the distribution networks and how they've shifted, that is the supply chains, the access to food. And until we create an integrated framework, which I know our colleague David is working very hard on in his work at AID, we are not going to see significant progress. We can't stop the climate very quickly. We can't change the way food moves around the world and change other governments' policies. But this is a collective global action, which is not separate from climate, but as urgent, because we can't go around and say that food is not a basic right. And let me just add one last thing before we get into the discussion with our panelists. You know, food is the oldest weapon of war, and it's also the cheapest. You don't have to have HIMARS to defeat the Russians. All you have to do is cut off the food supply. And we've seen this in the Ukraine. I had the honor of being in the Ukraine as a guest of their foreign ministry last October when they were actually looking at putting food and culinary diplomacy as part of their foreign, soft power. So the importance of food in that region, in the breadbasket of Europe, has been historically the goal of every conqueror. From Stalin to Hitler to now Putin, everybody wants that breadbasket, and it's not changed. So that's why when we talk about the title of this, Food Security and Conflict, the hidden threat, it isn't much of a hidden threat. It's right out there. And it's incumbent upon all of us as people who are policymakers, as people in the government, in the NGO sector, in the multilateral sector, to figure out a way to create this new framework about talking about the nexus of the two. So David, I'm going to put you on the spot because that's what happens when you get here first as the speaker. You know, we have hit a 30-year high in global violent conflict again with the war in Ukraine. And Russia's invasion shined a light on food insecurity and the link between global food security. You're in the conflict and violence prevention area at USAID. How does this real-time event impact the thinking going on in linking these two issues together?
So first to say there is an absolute connection between food security and conflict, but it's not a simple connection. It's not a straightforward equation of more of X equals more of Y. Food insecurity is what we would call a force multiplier or a compounding factor, meaning it is one among many other factors that amplify the pain felt by other conflict drivers. So rising in food insecurity tends to go along with poor governance, climate shocks, rapidly increasing debt, injustice, marginalization, exclusion. Those latter three are particularly important because food insecurity is rarely felt evenly across an entire population. Some are always going to be hungrier than others. There is a reason for that. Basically, what you're seeing is compounding factors. We can't solve conflict by adding more food any more than we can solve food insecurity by creating peace. It's just not that simple a link. We have to look at a cluster of factors, a matrix of factors, all of which impact each other. Food insecurity is certainly one of the more important ones, but it takes no one section of USAID or any donor, of donor funding, of implementing techniques, of sectoral work, has the ability to address this on its own. It takes working across all of those sectors. This is a great example of one of those places where peace building quite often really needs tangible outcomes in addition to peace. Peace is great, but if my kids are still starving, it's just not that powerful a motivator. So we are pushing because, as noted, there is a very large supplemental that got approved, none of which said anything about conflict, despite the fact that this money, a huge amount of money, is about to get programmed into some of the most volatile, unstable, conflict-affected places on the planet, which are exactly the conditions that will undermine that programming as fast as it can get put together. So we are working to make sure that across all of the sectors of USAID, that the fact we are going into conflict-affected areas, the fact that we can, by putting resources into these areas, also make things worse if we are unwise, if we are not careful about how we do this. There's the work now. The fact that the supplemental has been approved is great. That's American foreign assistance at its best as far as I'm concerned, but we need to make sure that we do that as best as possible. And that's not to say we should carve out part of it to become peace building work, right, but rather that bellies will not be filled as much or as long as they should if the work is being undermined by the conditions it's being programmed into. So we need to be very wise about that in order that the nutritional assistance, the agricultural assistance has the effect that it should.
Right. And you've said what is key to the point that I've tried to make is that food security is peace security. It is a part of human security. It is the component. And
done well, yes.
Correct.
Done poorly, it can have the opposite.
I'm going to try and run this more as a conversation, if you don't mind, because I want to just turn to you, Jonathan, for a minute, because you work on the ground. Your organization is working with people on the ground. So what David is talking about is the 10,000-foot view, but you see people on the ground every day who are struggling, who are small farmers. How do you see this infusion of money contributing to greater stability in the countries that you work in?
As David said, it has the potential to do that. but we need a new language and framework for thinking about how to look at all the different complex risks and shock and stress that go along with it. And then we need a very specific sort of intentionality in terms of cultivating the kinds of resilient capacities that are needed to address all these different factors, as well as the root causes of them, right? And so Food for the Hungry leads a consortium, a USAID-funded consortium for food and resilience in Ethiopia. And we're there right now with USAID doing do no harm training and local capacities for peace for all the partners in that space. But what we don't have is that 10,000-foot level connectivity to the bottom sometimes. And I think what that is beginning to look like, and this is a positive, is the notion of resilience. So if I said resilience a decade ago in a room like this, it would just be about food security, right? But there has been a positive and incremental shift to a much more strategic notion of resilience, right? The National Intelligence Council said last year, resilience will be the defining power of a sovereign nation moving forward because we're in an age of crisis. And at the top of it, you see that resilience is really about trying to locate what are the major compounding risks, interacting risks in a particular place that will disrupt development, that will disrupt food security. And then what are the political patterns, settlements that exclude, that create, that drive these risks? And how do you deal with the root causes, the risks, and the crises, right? The resilience has not only the imperative to look at more complex risk analysis and this whole approach, but it actually gives specific capacities that we don't typically get in a developmental frame. For development, it's about meeting needs, right? Even in the humanitarian world, right? It's for humanitarians, life-saving, life-sustaining needs, and for development, it's growth and poverty reduction through services and financing, et cetera. Resilience gives you a language its own that's done through development, but it's not development per se. It's building absorptive capacities to prevent, mitigate, and withstand shocks and stress, adaptive capacities that people and institutions and markets have, or they can have, to do things better, and then transformative capacities to either reach a big scale of providing for people through safety nets, for example, or getting to the root causes, the transform relationships, right? And I think there is a huge role for conflict prevention and peace building to come in and say, across these, develop these resilience capacities, how are we making sure the relationships are there that we need to, the conflict dimensions are very well known, and we're trying to get past and address those. Thank you.
So I want to go back now to the 10,000-foot view, because what you said about resilience also affects some of the things that Silke Boger is talking about with supply chains and the things that we saw that were most immediate in the pandemic, but are also still affecting everybody today in terms of ensuring that people have access to food. You're with the European Union. European Union has done incredible work globally, but also now in the war in Ukraine and trying to get this advanced. Comment a little bit on how you see the changes in commodity markets because of what has happened for this war.
Thank you, Johanna, and good morning to everybody. Yes, let me go back before the war. We had a situation of global supply chains that wasn't easy, and we have all felt that during COVID times. And coming from the European Union, I think we got away with relatively easily, let's say. So our food system within the EU has proven to be what you would say resilient, and had the infrastructure in place, the different institutions, all what is needed that in a very extreme situation, food can still flow. After some disruptions right at the start of COVID, it calmed down with some shifting in consumption. Globally, and also here in the US, I think it was felt even a little more. And when you look into the reasons for that, and it comes down to high dependency on few suppliers, an extreme, let's say, globalization and rationalization of chains that require a lot of international coordination. And in a world that functions relatively well, where the interconnection works, where transport is cheap, where every infrastructure is available, this economically, of course, makes most sense. And this is where big companies drive to. And now with the war on top of that fragile situation that COVID has demonstrated, we see then in the main food commodities globally, thankfully not yet rice, but I'm saying not yet because rice can come as a problem when it comes to food prices. But for the grains market, we have seen these extreme increases. The price was already high before the war. Now, during the war in Ukraine, the price of grains went up to an extent that immediately threatened millions of people when it comes to food security. We had, I think you spoke about the 200 million. This is about 40 million more than the year before, which is an enormous increase. I think it's unprecedented in terms of food insecure people. And I'm everything but an expert in conflict resolution, but experts say that 60% of food insecure people live in conflict regions. So of course there is a strong link that when the global system doesn't work, these are the ones that suffer most. And that's why it was very, very important. And the EU and the US worked closely with other partners, obviously, and focused a lot on how can this grain that is produced in Ukraine, that is an important contributor to world supply of grains, how it can be shipped. And we have, after hard work of many, many months, managed to avoid the worst, I would say. On the one hand, was building up new ways, landline ways for shipping grain out of Ukraine, which is more expensive. It's very, very difficult. It has a lot of infrastructural bottlenecks with storage, and then it ends up in regional markets in the EU where it shouldn't be, because it should go on the world market and should go in the countries where grains is most needed. But now with the Black Sea Agreement, a reopening of the seaways helps. And the expectation is now, and I think in August, the shipments came back to the pre-war levels of shipping grain out of Ukraine. It's a good sign also that the production and export capacity of Ukraine is estimated to be about the same as it was last year, because last year it was not fully exploited. So there is still grain from last year's harvest and the new harvest together. That's a positive sign. And that helped also, and you see that on the global grains markets, that the prices are not as critical anymore as they were a couple of months ago. However, what does this tell us a bit longer term is that, first of all, the war is not over. The war is not over, infrastructure problems are there. And the whole Black Sea Agreement is also not clear whether and how long it will actually work. We have all heard President Putin last week of starting to threaten a little bit that this agreement is abused, how he said it, by the Europeans, to get cheap maize, or corn, you would say here, which is not 100% correct, or not correct at all if you look at where the ships went. So all this is very, very important, and multilateral work, and you speak a lot about UN, but also in the WTO is very important to keep that global system functioning. Having said that, I think longer term, and that is a task that is overwhelmingly big, but we should not lose sight of the need to have also more regional and local markets that function, and to have more trade within Africa, for instance, and to have a better base for food supply where people live, and not only depend on functioning global markets. I think I'll leave it here. We'll come back to that at a moment.
Oh, I hope we come back to that, because that's a really key point that you've raised. You've raised many interesting points, but you mentioned something about the role that the multilateral institutions had in arranging something at a ground level. The Black Sea Agreement was brokered by the United Nations with the government of Turkey and with the government of Russia and with Ukraine. to at least get the grain moving. And in some ways, it is a success story of multilateralism because grain started moving out of Odessa, even though there were all kinds of problems and sabotage, but yet that grain is moving. But as you say, it's precarious because of the ongoing threats of an existing conflict in Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, one of the challenges in multilateral institutions, and we have a tool actually, which could address the broader question, and that's the Security Council resolution that was passed in 2018, 2417. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, which was a milestone in building global consensus around linking conflict and hunger. And it also took into account the protection of civilians agenda. But yet, even though we have this framework, enforcement is still the big gap in the multilateral system. That's why the Black Sea Agreement is so unusual. There was an urgency and a need. But what could we do under the existing Security Council resolution to perhaps get more countries engaged in punishing perpetrators or shedding a light and getting data on perpetrators? I'm going to turn to you, David, maybe if you want to talk about it, but anybody else on this panel who'd like to comment? I think, what is the purpose of having this resolution if we can't use it?
I can't speak to punishment. USAID doesn't do that. But as far as strengthening what it is that we do in this regard so that we are better at doing it, and people who are misusing the system have a harder time doing that. Certainly that we do. Really what it comes down to is building in, and this kind of goes back to that 10,000 foot level, building into our own systems the conflict sensitive mechanisms to do this program, to do any programming well, but certainly this one, better on the ground. That is doing the analysis first and foremost so that we understand the full depth and spread of conflict dynamics in the areas where we work. Who are the actors? What are the dynamics? What's really going on here? And making sure that the analysis, I mean, every program does some form of analysis when we go in, but linking conflict analysis and political economy analysis, for example, making sure that we have that from the beginning and that we do it ongoing throughout the program. These situations change. That's their nature. A conflict situation is volatile. It doesn't have to be active, ongoing shooting war to be volatile. We need to integrate conflict sensitivity throughout the entirety of the program life cycle. We need to look at the entire context. And when it comes to resilience, this has gotten mentioned a couple of times, but looking at resilience in terms of social and political resilience, as well as the resilience of market systems and the more technical side of that. Building in flexibility so that programs can adapt and pivot in these dynamic and potentially volatile conditions. We need to make sure that funding mechanisms, for example, in volatile areas are flexible mechanisms that allow for that, that are not rigid so that a program starts one way, has to continue that way. All of this is doable. We have the means to do it, and it's not actually that much of a lift, an additional lift for the programs on the ground, because we're not talking about now you have to be a food security program and be a peace building program. We're talking about the way we do programming, the analysis that we do, the mechanisms that we build in, this is how we do the things we're already there to do. These are not add-ons. So rather than making this a box checking exercise, because the institutions that are engaged in food security program are not punitive institutions. We don't have troops. We don't have, that's not something we're engaged in, but we can make sure that what we do in the best possible way, given the dynamics that we're going into. And that starts with recognizing what those dynamics are and then acting accordingly, designing the programs accordingly.
So I didn't mean to put you on the spot, David, but I think that's a good response. And I didn't mean the word punishment. I actually meant enforcement. If you have a Security Council resolution, you have to enforce it. And when I think Somalia is on the verge of a stage 5 famine. In fact, World Food Program thinks by next month it'll be in a famine. We have Yemen, we have South Sudan, of course, Afghanistan hovers over that, and Haiti is in a terrible situation, Venezuela is in a terrible condition. So the question is, what can one do to enforce, particularly when there are governments that are controlling the food supply? And we saw this in Syria, and we saw this in Yemen, where actually governments prevented the distribution of food to its citizens. As a collective community, what political agenda tools do we have short of force? What soft power tools do we have? How do we work with NGOs to help communities become, what you say, resilient? And I'm going to let Jonathan comment, and then I have a supply chain question with Silke.
I think within the council, it's of course increasingly complicated because there's a geopolitics of food happening too. There's a lot of major and emerging powers buying land or creating free trade zones in Africa to be able to get food back home. And so no one's going to want to be really enforcing too many sanctions when they're in the thick of it. And so I think what Silke had said a moment ago about getting more resilient production and supply chains happening in Africa would give decision makers and the council more options to be able to go and say, do this exactly here, inject this funding into this safety net, inject this into this food security system, etc. But at the high political level, I think it's going to be difficult running for the foreseeable future. I would also say, I absolutely agree with what Silke said about creating shorter supply chains and more connected and more resilient. They've got to be resilient as well, right? We've got to be looking at that adaptive capacity like the EU had, right? It was more expensive to do the land piece, but that was an adaptive mechanism. We cannot expect supply chains to just go on. If you build the best thing, the most efficient, the most well-financed, there's going to be disruptions, right? And this is what David was saying too. You've got to be extremely adaptive in these places. And again, this is why resilience gives it that language to say, how will these systems absorb shock and stress? How will they adapt? And how will they transform in the face of it? And if we aren't answering those questions, A, they're not resilient, and B, there's no real place for conflict prevention and peace building to come in because it's a needs versus risk conversation. It's two different paradigms.
So Silke, I think you made this very important observation about decentralizing global supply chains. In an ideal world, where would these be located? Where do you think there would be the best opportunities to start this? Is the EU looking at these options? What do you think?
Thank you. Yes, well, within the EU, I know this is not the topic of today, but we have recently started a new thinking about food systems. It's a system thinking. It's called Farm to Fork, and it's the attempt to transition the whole system to a more sustainable system. And with that thinking, a lot focuses also on also on the more diversification, less inputs, more resilience towards climate change, a shift in consumption habits. You can, to a certain extent, transfer the thinking into more in food insecure countries. And it's happening, I think, in development cooperation. A lot of the EU has kind of now in this crisis, they have mobilized 7.7 billion euros until 2024 for food security purposes, of which a large part is humanitarian aid, because this is necessary. We have a crisis right now, but another large part goes exactly into that thinking to build more local systems that function. This is nothing new. I think those of you that work in development cooperation have seen it for many, many years, and in some regions it works better than in others. This is then comes in again with how much and how we do it. Like David said it before, it can be done wrongly, and at the end the effect is that you have just created a new power distribution and all the work and all the resources that went into. were not yielding to the result we had wished for. But this is still, I think it's still the way to go forward. And especially with climate change and more disruption through extreme weather events. And we need also to look into which plants are available to feed the nations. We work on such a small basis of genetic material right now to feed the world. And that is also very, very dangerous, because these plants, we are not prepared for climate change, but our plants we're using in commercial agriculture are neither. So also there, a lot needs to be done. So when you think about establishing regional and more local systems, this is part of the game. It's not only about supply chains, it's about the agricultural basis you have. And I said I'm not an expert, but I heard the other day that about 50 years ago, so Africa was much more, if not all, self-sufficient when it came to food. And now it's not anymore. So there is also a lot of heritage and traditional production systems got lost, those that were adjusted more suitable for the climatic conditions. And so I think there is a lot to be done. But coming back to the global part, and it was said before, it is for the international and the multilateral community, it is very, very important to do a lot of diplomatic efforts to avoid trade restrictions. I'm contradicting myself a little bit, but I think we need to think these both strands. We also need to make sure at the same time that international trade flows. As soon as there is disruptions for major players, as we have seen with the war, as we have only seen with the announcement of Putin last week, where he threatens the system, immediately the price goes up, I think 7% at the Chicago Stock Exchange. Okay, it has come down again, but there is, trade restrictions are very, very harmful for food supply globally, and especially in the short term, where countries have no other choice than buying on international markets to feed their people. So we always need to keep both sides in mind.
Thank you. And I just want to ask a question, and everybody can chime in. There was a fact that I found really interesting, because I think, give the private sector a real pass. And yet, if this number is correct, 350 companies account for half of the world's agricultural revenue. That's pretty amazing in a world of 8 billion people now, and they employ 23 million people around the globe. I know that we're looking more at integrating private sectors into the decision-making to achieve decentralization, better flow of supply, integrating that thinking into the humanitarian community. But what do we need to do so that this farm to fork, or whatever other name you want to call the program, takes into consideration that we're not going to leave business behind? We're in a world of global capitalism, and that's not going to end, but getting them to embrace resilience as part of their philosophy, which is essential if we're all going to survive climate change and conflict. So perhaps I'll turn this over first to Silke, but everybody should comment on it.
That's very difficult. So I will speak a bit off the record. Hopefully nobody cites me, but yes, again, there is, I think there's both sides to it. We were extremely grateful to have traders on the ground taking the risk to ship that grain out of Ukraine. So that is the private sector dimension that was very, very positive, because if you had done that with a public effort, it would have failed miserably. So we relied on the infrastructure. They were there, they were ready. The downside, maybe you could say, is the risk they were taking. They were not taking it only for themselves. The farmers in Ukraine, for instance, the price they've got for their grain is so little that they hardly can survive. And when you look at the company results of the 4 biggest traders this year, so Cargill, Bunge, ADM, and Louis Dreyfus, they all have had record profits this year after last year's record profits. So you also see a little bit, how does this work? Is there enough corporate social responsibility in these companies. For me, it's not an either or, this is how much would we need to push them to help also take an internationally solidaric approach and make sure that, for instance, now I'm speaking about Ukrainian farmers again, to make sure that they can keep producing. Because if they paid so little or so late, because also the way they are paid right now is different to before the war. Before the war, they were paid when the grains were loaded. Now they are paid when the grains have arrived at destination. So meaning all the risk to the shipment in case the ship is bombed is much more on the side of the Ukrainian farmers. So when you think about international practices, and I'm not at all against the private sector, we need a private sector, and the private sector saved us also during COVID. However, I think there is some sort of discussion necessary also in how there is a burden shift and what can the public sector do as well to maybe mitigate that a little bit, that we have a fairer distribution of burden.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I put you on the spot because that was a terrific answer. David, any thoughts on that about how the private sector partners are being integrated into this work at AID?
Major thought is balance. The single word that comes to mind with this, because there's tension inherent to that question. Yes, the private sector needs to be involved. We're looking at more involvement with the private sector. We're looking at pushing conflict sensitivity with the private sector to be more resilient and integrated with the places that they work in the private sector, but we can't do that at the cost of the local, the smallholder, the family. And there's where we really see the tension in a lot of places. Especially when we're talking about companies at the size of the ones that you're mentioning, but they don't have to be that big. Working with companies at that level in many places, you're talking water access issues, you're talking land access issues, you're talking the cost of land going up to an unsupportable level for local farmers because larger agricultural concerns are coming in. Unsustainable fertilizer practices, for example. There's a lot that USAID does that requires us to work with the local farmer, the small company. And that's the idea. I mean, there's where we're really trying to build more equity into the system by building some sort of parity as much as we can. Because working only with the largest tends to add to the sense of inequity and injustice in many of these areas. I was in Burkina Faso in January, and this was a fairly common conflict dynamic that we saw across the country, is farmers telling us we can't get access to water because the sugarcane farmers are here, because the large agricultural concerns are here, and they have simply blocked that off. We don't have enough. We can't afford the land anymore because it's going to companies like this that are driving the prices up, whether they intend to or not. That's the nature of that kind of investment. So the biggest thing for us is balance. Do we need investment from, do we need partnership from, do we seek partnership and investment with the private sector? Yes, but there has to be a sense of balance, because if that begins to increase the negative dynamics within those local, within the smallholder, within the family, within that infrastructure, that, you know, the long-term sustainability and peace in these areas depends on the people who are there, not the company who is there. So we are working much more on that other local end in order to build the networking, the resilience, the capability of the small, not against, but in order that they can advocate, in order that they have power within that system and agency within that system to survive and thrive. And here's, with climate change in mind, one of the warnings that we're looking at is, as climate change worsens, the solutions are probably, unless we're very careful about it, going to tend to favor the large concern. at the expense, if we're not careful, of those small and of the local. So balance is the key word where it comes to that.
David, thank you for that good overview. But I want to turn to Jonathan as someone who works in an organization that is a practitioner on the ground. How does this play out even today in the countries you're involved in, so many of the developing countries around the world? What do you see on the ground with this tension?
So I think it's, as David was saying before, it's complex and it's adaptive, and you need that balancing. And the question is, at what level does that balancing happen and who's involved with it, right? So let's take avocados, for example, in Colombia, right? Avocado demand has gone up 1,000% in China. It's gone up significantly in the EU and the US, right? And so the government said, we're gonna open up incentives for avocado investment. Well, all the smallholder farmers could not aggregate. They didn't have the mobilization capacities. They were not able to come and meet that demand. So some of the big concerns that you were mentioning before came in and did that. Now, if you're looking at it from a conflict lens, you might say, wait a minute, the peace agreement, one of the ways that we were going to smooth out the peace agreement was to get the ex-combatants working in smallholder farms, so that there's this money coming in, there's this social cohesion at the local level coming in. And if these big concerns come in and squeeze out the land and push them to the side, maybe you're going to have a conflict problem. But the point I want to accent is, but maybe not. What it would potentially require then is to say, look, this is a growth path for Colombia, but you would then need is maybe social protection safety nets to come in and capture the problems of consumption and lack of money being squeezed out, right? So you're having to look at the growth path and then how to reinvest that for resilience, right? And this is a very huge topic right now when it comes to even how the West is trying to fund climate adaptation in the global South, right? The Breakthrough Institute, for example, has said, look, you should be letting them burn fossil fuels. You should be letting them burn some of these things that they need to really massively grow their economy, because their emissions are going to be a fractal of what the big emitters are doing, but they really need it to grow infrastructure and roads and in reinvest, et cetera, right? So where do we get this sort of conversation going in these countries? For 20 years, there have been experiments of what are now called country platforms in these places, but they are the most invisible experiments. It's all happening on the ground. There's no global doctrine, there's no guiding thing, but you see them in Somalia. Actually, new evidence is showing that in Somalia, they've been the thing that has held the place together in the sense of a center of gravity between donors and government and parts of civil society implementing partners at different levels. And I really believe that it's the country platform idea that if we really invest in it, you can have a place to have these discussions, policy and political dialogue at a high level, technical levels with ministries of education and health and food and economy and infrastructure and justice, and then a secretariat with the planning ministry. And I've written about this extensively. The World Bank is committed to strengthening country platforms in 11 fragile places. One, which was going to be Ethiopia before the storms came, before Tigray, et cetera. And it didn't mobilize in time. But we're seeing the OECD, we're seeing UNDP, we're seeing the G20 all saying we need to get these things going and get all the DFIs, the development finance institutions, involved as well to solve some of these bigger issues of supply chains. And so I think going forward, these country platforms are going to be really key to having that kind of balancing function if we invest properly in them.
I'll say one,
Please.
2-second thing on that, because there are two things that he was just saying that I think are really important. Along with balance, one is protection, that working towards a technical conception of progress without protecting at every social level is really going to drive forward those inequities and give us some conflict risks. But the other is the coordination, because there's, yes, there are levels of economic progress that require the large as well as the small. The degree to which there is tension between the different levels is the degree to which we are not communicating with each other at our different levels and integrating those discussions so that what's being done in one doesn't undermine the other. And that conversation is going to be absolutely critical. So platforms through which that conversation happens will be absolutely important. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I'm going to ask one last question before we open it up to our large audience, because we've been having a good time digging into these issues, but I'm sure lots of people in the room and around the world who are looking at this program want to contribute. So I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the Global Fragility Act, because in the United States, that has become the driving force on trying to integrate the concept of conflict prevention and food security, much to the chagrin of some of my colleagues at USAID and other institutions. Trying to weave these two strands together has been a Promethean task, though I think it will eventually happen. So, and what you said, Jonathan, about community-based initiatives is such a hopeful way to look at it, but these platforms, but both maybe all, I know that this is a US issue, but it's an issue also in the EU, but maybe David and Jonathan, if you'd like to comment on these challenges that we have of how does a strategy that is so forward-looking in terms of trying to prevent things not really integrating with the global food strategy at this point, but needs to be done. And then how does the US government and partner nations, which relates to our colleagues in the European Union, ensure that food security is factored into all plans to addressing conflict prevention? So it's a two-level issue within our own government, but then within our partner nations who also are as concerned as we are about improving the lives of other people. So David, would you like to go first, or Jonathan, because I'm whomever?
Sure. So the Global Fragility Act is both an incredibly hopeful thing and the bane of the daily life of those of us who work on it. Yes, thank you. So here's the advantage that the GFA gives us is when you get down to it, are there details that were not specifically written into the Global Fragility Act? Sure. Some, at least to the degree that we would like them to be. But what the GFA really tells us is work differently, work in concert, work across lines, break out of silos, be more flexible, make sure the analysis is done, get that proactive sense into everything that we do that says, look, we want to look at long-term goals, not short-term expedience. And that was one of the really powerful statements coming out of the beginning of it is, look, you know, we have this experience of Iraq and Afghanistan. Some things went well, some things went very badly. Among the things that went very badly was we were so focused on how do we get this locked down as fast as possible that we forgot to look as much as we should at how do the local populations, how does the local governance, how does this country, how do these people need this to progress towards their own strategic goal. And before anybody tries to quote me on that, that actually is in the public discussion on this back in the day. So there's where we have a real advantage with things like the Global Fragility Act, because unless we have, getting any of this work done requires people at the missions, in the program implementers, in headquarters, all working together, yes, but we can't have that be ad hoc. You know, in this country, it works really well because there are champions and we've got really good people. In that country, there's no champions, so it just doesn't get done. We want to be able to get this to as consistent a level as possible. That's easiest when you have a high-level policy or strategy that says thou shalt. You have to work with the interagency. That's now written into policy. You have to coordinate and look at this situation not just as an ag person or a USAID ag person or whatever programmatic silo you happen to come from, but how do I interoperate that programming with all of the rest of the components of the US interagency or international, and make sure, you know, one of the first things I said today, look, no one sector, no one donor, no one program has the ability to fix problems this complex on its own. So there's the advantage of something like the Global Fragility Act, is that top level thou shalt that says, you need to coordinate. Nobody has any one piece of this, not you, not you, not you. Get together, have that conversation, make sure everything we're doing contains the components of all of the rest of this so that we get a complex answer for a complex question, because trying to shoehorn complex questions into simple answers never works, period. So there's where, you know, is food security mentioned to the degree that might have been useful? No. Is it there because that is part of the complex problem and part of a complex answer, and this says make sure you take that into account? Yeah. So we do have a real advantage with something like the GFA in the way that it's phrased. And there is some, not vagueness, but breadth baked into that basically says, look, if we didn't remember to put every single thing in here, we can still include that because we are mandating complexity in our thinking. And that's what it really takes to get all of this done.
Well, from your lips to the implementer's ears, would you like to comment on that? Or?
Sure. So I think the GFA had one reference to food emergencies.
Yeah.
The Global Fragility Strategy makes explicit reference to conflict dynamics relating to food insecurity. So there's a step there. Talking about this new kind of strategic, what Christina Georgieva from the IMF recently called a macro strategic approach to resilience, you have that in the strategy, right? You have an approach in the strategy that says, we will look at complex interacting risks and then pull from all different parts of the interagency to try to address those with local partners through country coordination mechanisms, that essentially platforms that bring government together with others to do that, the tough work of trying to line up different sectors, but within this notion of a policy and political dialogue with government and others. You have to go into that with a political settlements understanding and all the rest to really make it conflict sensitive and enlightened in the sense of what you can do in a political context that isn't regulated very well. And it has a provision for being adaptive, right? This idea that one assessment, one report is a snapshot in time, unless you learn as you go, in terms of iteration. And it's not just about being flexible in the face of a crisis, it's what methods are we using to really understand more about this context? How are we bringing together different parts of the interagency and other partners to get glimpses of this operating context, right? The World Bank, a very conservative organization on the political front, came up with a report a couple of years ago on service provision in violent contexts, looking at food and others. And they said it's best to look at political settlements if you're going to do anything else, right? And the settlement here is the national settlement that holds the whole thing together, even fragilely. The local secondary settlement, how things work at a very local level and how it connects up. And then the sector settlement, right? And food and others, who's running the shots? And it's from there that if you can then take a resilience approach and layer in the risk analysis and landscape, looking at crisis, looking at specific coping, adaptive, transformative capacities, and having a coordination mechanism that kind of brings it all together, that's progress. And that is embedded in the strategy. The big question for me builds on what David was saying was the perennial problem of how you get the interagency to work together on some of this, but one level up too, which is who has the brain trust, that sense of what the ambition could be of the strategy, that's going to talk to ambassadors, that's going to talk to teams and say, look, it's not a project, right? You're not trying to do gender-based violence in Papua New Guinea and that's 10 years worth, right? Mm-hmm. How are you actually meeting the spirit and the potential of this act, right? And it's of course cliche and default to say there should always be a special coordinator for anything that needs interagency cooperation, but I wonder in this context, if you need someone that really gets the potential and what's needed, and this kind of is on top of this paradigm shift that's happening from fragility to resilience in a much bigger way, right? The EU strategic approach to resilience, Club de Madrid just came out with their Democracy in Emergencies report, looking all about resilience and so forth. Is there the need for that kind of thought leadership level within the organization to really see and push the envelope?
Just a really quick addendum to that, because he's hitting on a lot of important stuff. One of the really helpful parts of the GFA is the word fragility and resilience, that we are getting past looking at conflict solely and narrowly in terms of active violent shooting war, but looking proactively at all of those components that tend to lead that direction. And there again, one of the things that gives us a bit more power to look at something like food insecurity and conflict is that food insecurity is not just some sui generis thing that happens because there's too little food. You're talking about resilience in the supply chains. You're talking about governance. You're talking about climate shocks. You're talking about a whole series of things that all collectively fall within the heading of something like fragility. Conflict, active violent conflict is certainly one of those, but there are a lot of others as well. So the minute we take a step back and look at even conflict in context of this larger picture of things that tend to go along with it, contribute to it, that it contributes to, we get a much more preventive kind of a lens on things like this intersection between food security and conflict.
Can I just say one thing on this? Now, you know, now it's all, we're ready, we're warmed up.
And I want to say that Richard has a question after you, so please.
I'll be quick. A fragility forum that the World Bank does every 2 years. Vera Songway was there. She's the head of the East Africa Economic Commission. And she said, we, all the donors and partners were in Sudan, and we were figuring out how are we going to support this transition to a civilian government, right, from the military. And we thought, let's get rid of fuel subsidies, because that's good macroeconomic balance payment sort of thing. And it will increase revenue to the government and will help them reinvest and build a constituency and so forth. So they did it, and it caused massive protests. It destabilized any attempt at the civilian government. And what was, I mean, we know this about the potential of subsidies, right? It knocked out several Haiti governments successively in the past, we know Egypt, etc. But what Vera said that was so startling and interesting was, nobody raised that as a risk in the room. We all agreed unanimously to get rid of the subsidy, and there was no risk-informed approach to what we were doing, which shows how entrenched the old paradigm of just developmental, macroeconomic, formulaic, just get it done is. And the IMF's new strategy on fragility takes issue with that and says, we really have to reform ourselves and get into this resilience mindset of risks and capacities. Just wanted to make that point.
Well, it's a great point, and I'm glad you raised it. I keep on thinking back to Paul Collier's Grieve and Grievance. I was working with Paul at the bank in 1994, and basically he had those elements of signs of conflict, which were not only violence, but all kinds of things that you mentioned, David, and you mentioned, Jonathan, about prices on, you know, supply chains and governance that were all signals, including corruption, that we didn't even mention as things to be looking out for. So the risks are there, and you just have to, you know, want to do things to prevent those risks from exacerbating an already difficult environment. But my dear colleague, Richard, from the Stimson Center and head of global governance there, and has done some great work, you wanted to ask a question, so please.
And it's, of course, a global governance related question. We're eager to hear from everybody, though. The microphone on so you can hear my question online. Johanna mentioned at the outset the world food architecture. Immediately, World Food Program, FAO, we brought up the UN Security Council resolution in today's discussion from 2018. Well, next year, as we head into UNGA in the next week, and this is for us the kickoff of a series of UNGA-related discussions, and last year, of course, was a World Food Summit at the outset of UNGA. We're going to be a year out from an SDG summit, the midway point of the big 2030 agenda, but equally important on systems change that Silke referred to several times in her remarks is now the date is September 2024, Summit of the Future. This is looking at system-wide reform on a scale not seen since the 60th anniversary of the UN in 2005. Besides an outcome document that will look across the major pillars, peace and security, sustainable development, human rights, there will be a new agenda for peace document. There'll be a declaration for future generations that I think will speak to many of these issues. So, you know, in light of David kicking things off in the framing of how food security is one among many important force multipliers contributing as a conflict driver, to Silke getting into climate change, arguably the critical issue of our time, and the links then to food insecurity, let alone conflict. What then system-wide proposals related to just these critical agencies, FAO and WFP, or back to the Security Council, should we be thinking about these next 2 years?
Go ahead.
David, would you like to? You seem to be the stucky, as we say.
Just trying to avoid hogging the mic. It's going to be coordination. What kind of government structures, what do we need to be focused on is coordination. We need to get out of the silos. This, again, something that the GFA is good for reminding us to do. Can we talk about food insecurity without talking about climate change? No. Can we talk about climate change and food insecurity without talking about conflict and fragility? No. That coordinative mechanism means thinking differently across how we do things. And that's a global we. That's I can't think of a donor or multilateral organization that is free from this kind of problem. We need to re-examine how we do things. We need to get out of the silos first and foremost and see those connections and work as compound efforts. There's the biggest answer that I could give you is to the degree that we think in terms of food security is a nutritional problem, conflict is a peace-building problem, we will fail. So the coordinative mechanisms breaking out of those silos and officially breaking out of those silos. I mean, that's going to take a thou shalt in addition to people who understand this and work differently and integrate that across everything from the nuts and bolts upwards. There are structural shifts that we need to make. We're in the process of that, but certainly that will need to accelerate.
Thank you. Jonathan, you wanted to say something? Would you like to add? Or?
I've spoken a lot about country platforms, and I think that the coordination piece is fundamental to have the food agencies there as part of a much bigger kind of a resilience approach. But strikingly, a couple of years ago, Susanna Moorhead, who is the head of the DAC, the major donors group at the OECD, was in conversation with the head of the Center for Global Development. And she said, there is no global platform to talk about environment and development and just those issues, let alone with security. And it's fascinating because you have things like the high-level political forum, but it's more like a succession of speeches, right? You have COP, right? But as the Prime Minister of Barbados said, we leave COP needing another COP, right? So there isn't really this kind of global space to have the real conversations. You've got a little bit of that coming out of the G20, and they're using that, and the G7. But what can the UN do to really create a mechanism where it's real dialogue across multiple angles to see that big picture? You have the Peace Building Commission with their country configurations and talking in that place, I think, a little bit more liberally. So there's something there. You have the Ecosoc ad hoc group at Haiti, which I thought did incredibly useful work after the 2010 earthquake, when there was a commission there that was not really designed well, essentially a country platform that had no ministerial presence. There were no sectors. You couldn't get to the food conversation because there was no space. And it was over the course of 2 years and visits from the Ecosoc group that said, this is dysfunctional, right? And just like the GFA gives you permission to go and say, we have to do things differently, I think these kinds of mechanisms at a high level can do that too, but they're not really working well. So we need to call out the examples of the ones that do interesting work, like the Ecosoc piece and some of the peace building work, but then really get to a place where can we really have this bigger conversation? Maybe it's a constellation of little groups that come together. That's the only way you can do it politically, or maybe it's this kind of grand thing, but we need to have something that really performs that function, and it's missing right now.
Well, just a very partial answer, and not so much on the how, but on the what. I think when food security should definitely be in the focus and will be in the focus in the next years. First of all, this crisis is not a short-term crisis. We will stay with it for a couple of years, so it will remain high on the agenda. How do we solve it? A lot has come out of the Food Summit already in terms of trying to have sustainable productivity growth. There is this constant thinking around, we are more people, we're gonna be more people on this planet, so we need to produce more food. This is all good, but in my view, it's not good enough. What also needs to be done, and we need to start at our own plate, let's say, is that we think differently about how we produce food and what kind of diets we have. We all know that in the Western world, the diets are not sustainable, not for ourselves, health-wise, and not for the planet. So this thinking often is pushed away too quickly. This is a knowledge that is around there, and I think it's not rocket science. Everybody knows that a shift towards a healthier and more climate-friendly diet is necessary, but it is not fully integrated in the whole strategic thinking on how we can improve security food security, in my view.
So, oh, okay.
I'm going to do another 2-second addition just to say that when we talk about what needs to be improved and added over the next few decades, one of the major ones is making this not a one-way discussion. So it tends to come from us, from the West, from the government, from the multilateral downwards. And we really need to get the localization moving and make sure that the dialogue isn't just that we're building platforms and pathways for information to get to us, to direct us from the communities that we're working with, and not just have it be a one-way conversation.
So I think that's a wonderful recommendation. And I noticed two things. Nobody mentioned China and nobody mentioned Russia. And yet they are essential players going forward in what is going to happen. Russia in terms of the energy relationship and the fertilizer relationship. And nobody mentioned that. And also China, because their own agenda in the developing world is certainly very clear in terms of offering lower priced commodities right now, and countries have often no choice but to take those in order to survive. So I think maybe, Liz, the idea would be to have yet another conversation that would include this agenda. We're going to take questions now, both from people in the room as well as people online. But I want to remind everybody that next week, the 21st, is World Peace Day. We observe it every year. It is something that is very important at the United Nations, but should be in your own community, in your own NGO. And this year's theme of ending racism to build peace is certainly appropriate with the things that have happened globally. So I just want to remind you that we talk about these issues within the context of peace building, and I want to see some hands up or some questions that are around for these terrific panelists. Okay, yes.
Hi, I'm going to read you a question from online, which I think segues very good into your point about China and specifically Russia. So Russia's policy decisions have been central to the 3 major food crises of the 21st century and the current crisis. Thinking beyond crisis response strategies, what can be done to insulate global markets from Russia's disruptive food and fuel trade related policies? An easy one. So essentially, Russia's been a problematic actor in this space for some time. They've been responsible for a number of the food crises over the last 2 decades or so. What can we do as an international community, as EU, US, UN implementers, to insulate global markets from Russia's disruption and on food and fuel related approaches?
Well, I think it is done to the extent possible already. That would be my first and short answer. I think the international community works as much as it can with those willing to cooperate to make the world market work even without Russia. Having said that, there is no intention, and all the false narrative around the sanctions, there is also no intention to exclude Russia, because Russia is an important player and is an important provider of food. And you have here a huge country with a huge agricultural production capacity, and just because, and now I'm saying Russia is a difficult international player, but it's not Russia. It's the regime that rules Russia right now that is problematic. And you should, when you think longer term, in my view, it would be wrong to say we want to have a planet where Russia is no longer part of. But at the moment, I think the international community does whatever needs. And for me, one of the most obvious, let's say, examples is that Black Sea Agreement, is to make sure, okay, you are not cooperating when it comes to making these markets globally work, but there was so much diplomatic pressure and so much pressure also that eventually it will be Russia's fault if more people than necessary, you know, are pushed into food insecurity that made them cooperate to the extent.
Yeah, please.
So it's really interesting to think about fertilizer, right? It comes up in this conversation. Before China started opening its infrastructure fund and getting more infrastructure into Africa and other places, the aid community was largely focused on services and kind of saying no to infrastructure. But then it really got into the game as well, right? You see the World Bank and others doing this. The fertilizer issue is the new infrastructure in many ways, because they're expensive, they're not good for the environment, they're all these things, but they are what's required to grow large agricultural commodities to feed populations and so forth. And when you read what happened to Sri Lanka recently, it was this sharp push led by IFIs and others, really strong, on organics. And we would give you conditional loans, large loans if you did that. And it just killed the agricultural sector, right? And as a result, destabilized a lot of what's going on. And so it's about looking at what are the trade-offs, right? It's the balance that I think David was talking about. What's worse? Expensive fertilizers that the aid community will have to subsidize, but we'll keep the majority of a population fed and produce some yield as well for profit, or to be really strict on a renewables and clean kind of agenda, but then have these conflict consequences, right? And these are tough questions. This is what the Breakthrough Institute and others have been really focusing on too. And the point with Russia is that where everybody else closes off that gate to fertilizers and countries say, we really need them or else we're going to be Sri Lanka, the only availability then becomes a Russia or a China on infrastructure in the beginning. So just, this is part of the balancing, this is part of the risk weighing and the costs and the benefits.
Any other questions in the room before? Yes, please. There's a microphone there if you'll just.
Hi, so I'm a university student and I came here because I wanted to get educated on this issue. And I know that y'all are talking about very high level like thinking and like policy making, but how can just, I guess, regular people on the ground, like regular like students like me, kind of get involved and try to do our own part? Maybe it's like really small and like it like depends on like my decisions as a consumer or something, but what could I do in order to like at least like make some kind of difference?
So what university are you at? I'm just kidding. Sure.
I'm from Texas, so I go to the University of Texas at Austin, but I'm just in DC for this semester.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as a professor, I mean, I've been looking at a lot of these issues on campus, and I think you ask a really critical question, because when you hear the overwhelming nature of these challenges that our panelists have so gracefully articulated, you say, what can I do? I've been reading a lot about different things that people are thinking about. There's a British philosopher named McCaskill who's talking about effective altruism. I don't know if you know about that movement, but he started this idea of, he's a philosopher who giving a certain percentage of your wealth to a cause that you feel is important, as opposed to just working locally. I don't know that I buy into that, because there are lots of practical examples of things you can do in addition to tithing. But I do think it is a stunning way to think about focusing on one problem and committing your own personal wealth, not the wealth of a Bezos or a Gates Foundation, but your own commitment is to what we say in the United States of putting your money where your mouth is and doing things. Now, that's a hard thing to do when you're a college student, but it's become a powerful movement. And I've been very impressed with what is going on in thinking that, you know, what I just do, you know, not eating my sandwich, a meat sandwich, but going for a, you know, an organic product or a non-meat product is fine. But there are other things that you need to get your community to do that focus on an issue. So it doesn't only have to be money. I see it with the food movement. I see it with chefs who during the pandemic, people who had very luxurious high cost restaurants converted their restaurants to food kitchens. That's a real adaptive, dynamic way of addressing problems. People who are refugees who come to this country getting trained in new skills so that they can integrate. Those are adaptive mechanisms. Because the other thing we did not mention in this panel is migration. The challenge that we face, in addition to all these other food problems and climate issues, is that climate is the biggest driver of migration now. And it is coming to all places, developed and underdeveloped places alike, internally displaced people, people who are migrating to the United States. DC has a migration problem because of people coming from Texas and being sent here. So students can organize around these and help people. I get calls every day to help people coming from Texas to reintegrate. And there's a lot of things that you can do. Now you're in Texas, maybe you can help stop your governor from sending people, but I won't go into that. But I just feel very strongly that students are powerful. Students are the best observers, in my understanding, of hunger on campus. How did hunger on campus get addressed? It didn't get addressed through the administration. It was addressed by students realizing that many, especially of our foreign students or our less fortunate students, didn't have food aside from the food services, and they built a food pantry. American University actually has a farm and they do gleaning. They have the food, the extra foods that's grown brought to the campus now on Wednesdays, and any student can take it for free from the market. So small steps, but this can happen because it has a multiplier effect. And yeah.
May I add one little thing, but it's actually not little, it's huge. Everybody could contribute to trying to avoid food waste. Food waste and food loss in the EU is 20% of our production. I don't have a reliable figure for the US. I only know it's higher. Some people speak about up to 40%. When you just imagine that for a moment, 40% of all the food produced in this country is not eaten. And it's not only using resources and adding to climate, to greenhouse gas emissions while it's produced, it also adding to another use of resources in being destroyed. So every day when you only eat half of the sandwich and you're not hungry, not throwing that sandwich away, but taking it home and continue eating it the next day or something, or choosing the way you buy and use food helps. And everybody can contribute to that very easily.
You know, we could probably go on with this conversation for another hour or two, and it's a wonderful group of people. Thank you, by the way, for raising that question about students, and good luck here on your semester. But I would be remiss if I didn't turn it over to my co-organizer, Richard Ponzio of the Stimson Center, to have a few closing words. But thank you to all our panelists for your participation and your excellent contributions. Megan, thank you. And Liz, thank you for bringing us together.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Johanna. Terrific job, of course, facilitating. And on behalf of the two co-organizing institutions, thanks to all of you participants and panelists. Very rich, thought-provoking discussion today on this critical topic of food security and conflict. And it, as I mentioned in my question, it for us kicks off UNGA season around the corner in New York. And these issues could not be more critical at this moment. We saw in the spring, shortly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Secretary of State Blinken had a whole thematic session in the Security Council on the food crisis and the implications caused by the war in Ukraine. And I heard from a senior US diplomat in July that among the top, there's usually a top 3 issues that the US government brings to the table for any UNGA speech. You'll hear from the President Biden on Tuesday and other world leaders. Food insecurity and the linkages to conflict will, for the US at least, be among the top 3. Very brief summing up. I won't be able to do a comprehensive job. I'm sure we'll have a short write-up of this meeting, but a note that I thought Johanna kicked things off nicely with the 3 points that we need to know. We need to focus on food as a human right. It's a core component of stability and peace, and the issues of reforming the global system and especially access to food. I thought that lined up with 3 key themes or threads of our discussion today. David kicked us off with just the framing of seeing food as not the only conflict driver, but a really critical force multiplier, a compounding factor, as he called it. And that lines up nicely with the whole thought of food as a fundamental human right. But the issue of resilience that really came up from all 3 of our panelists, but especially David or Jonathan, it lines up nicely with this notion of being a component, not just stability and peace, but linkages to environment, development, to humanitarian community. It's a concept that we can rally around. And I'm going to tell you about a proposal in a second called a Global Resilience Council. And then this 3rd area of the reform of the global system and access to food, very much at the heart of Silke's contributions on systems thinking. Silke brought up the fact that actually we're seeing progress just in a few short months of the grain deal in Ukraine. That's a good news story, and getting back to pre-war levels. Let's not forget there was the issues around COVID the last 2-3 years. We're still seeing that have affected supply chains. That's an understatement. But at the same time, that you saw the numbers that we had in promoting today's session. They're just shocking. 1.7 billion people food insecure. And even if, we're on track to meet some of the SDG progress by 2030, the estimates are horrible that 60 million people will suffer from hunger. Numbers even, have gone up as a result of COVID. We spoke quite a bit. I was pleased to see Johanna inject into the discussion the critical UN Security Council Resolution 2417 from 2018, and a number of then critical proposals were put forward, which I think was the emphasis of our discussion. What are some solutions? And of course, linking conflict analysis to political economy analysis. When we look at resilience, we look at all of its dimensions, social, political, economic. We talk quite a bit, and I think this links to the GFA discussions, funding mechanisms that are quite flexible and tailored to the changing nature of conflict on the ground. You don't just come in with one size fits all toolkits. You're always adaptive in a conflict situation. But then getting to the big systems, even at the global level discussion, it was great that not only Silke and talking about the connections to climate change, but Jonathan, when you raised there is no platform at the global level that links the way the Security Council is looking at these issues, Ecosoc, all the COPs now and environmental issues. So our friends at the Foundation on Global Governance and Sustainability, a think tank based in Brussels, have been putting forward an excellent idea of a Global Resilience Council that would tie things together. The Secretary General is talking about a somewhat similar concept of an emergency platform in the context of Our Common Agenda and ideas feeding into this Summit of the Future in 2 years' time. And to finish up with 2 final points, it was great that we didn't just focus on governments, international organizations, but we looked at especially public-private interventions. But David rightly noting, watch about privileging multinational corporations at the expense of small local farmers. And this got at the essence of how we should be reacting and seeking the implementation of the big 3 letters GFA that Alliance for Peace Building is known to champion. And that is to not just, think about it in terms of top-down approaches, what we hear in Washington and government and international organizations can do, but that fundamental question David raised, how do local populations progress to their strategic goals? It could be multiple goals, but we're hopefully dealing with food insecurity, conflict prevention being among them. And then we got into, again, more specifics about the need for this critical word of coordination among the diverse range of actors to address what is undoubtedly one of the most complex problem sets around, when just pairing the 2 twin issues of conflict prevention and food insecurity. And finally, back to the fundamental concept of resilience, adopting such approach means looking at not just national, but local and sector settlements, as Jonathan noted. So thank you once again. I would like to turn over to our real drivers of today's program, Megan and Liz, if you'd like to say any final words, but thank you, Silke, David, Jonathan, Liz, and especially Johanna for such a great program today.
Just more to come. This is just the beginning of this conversation, and it's going to take a lot more work from our community moving forward to address the conflict, peace building, and food crisis. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.